As the French writer and feminist Simone de Beauvoir once said, "One is not born a woman, one becomes one." Simone's quote emphasizes the idea that the behavior of women is not based upon their instinctive nature, rather it is structured upon the oppression of the patriarchal society. Like American feminism, French feminism consists of various viewpoints that push for social and political activism to bring equality for women. To explain these various viewpoints, French feminism is broken into two subcategories that are often interconnected: materialist feminism and psychoanalytic feminism. While materialist feminism focuses on the socioeconomic oppression of women, psychoanalytic feminism looks at the psychological experience of women. French materialist feminism is interested in the oppression of women in society through patriarchal traditions and institutions. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, written in 1949, lays the groundwork for the ideas of materialist feminism. In the text, Beauvoir emphasizes how, while men are seen as individual people, women are perceived to be contingent beings whose meaning is rooted in their relation to men and not in themselves. Therefore, they are considered inadequate compared to men and seen as inferior. This inferiority of women is rooted in social constructionism, which in the context of gender refers to the societal creation of gender categories which dictate the behavior of males versus females. This theory, for example, justifies a woman's work as a caretaker because of their maternal instincts, yet, in reality, this is a trait within all members of a species. Beauvoir then explains that the inability for women to realize their subjection or combat this subjection is rooted in the lack of a historical record of women's oppression. Unlike other oppressed groups, women do not have a tangible historical record of oppression, and as a result, Beauvoir emphasizes how there lacks an allegiance among women that serves to support and advocate for their rights. Similar to Beauvoir's description of men as independent beings and women as contingent beings, Guillaume, another French materialist feminist, points out how while men are referred to for their accomplishments and abilities, women are viewed for their sex. This reference to women by their sex reduces them to objects, which Guillaume describes to be sexage or objectification. She classifies sexage into four distinct forms, which Tyson describes to be the appropriation of women's time, the appropriation of the products of women's bodies, women's sexual obligation, and women's obligation to take care for whichever members of the family can't take care for themselves, as well as for the healthy male members. The view of women as slaves or objects can be manifested through various behaviors exhibited in society in the past and even today. For example, women's time is appropriated when they're expected to run the household regardless of whether they have other obligations, even on weekends and holidays. The appropriation of the products of women's bodies reveals itself in the cultures of some parts of the world, which establish that the man of the family determines how many children the woman should conceive. Guillaume also observes that the appropriation of women's sexual obligation occurs in marriages and prostitution alike, as the woman is called to satisfy the man. Lastly, there are societal expectations that force the role of the caretaker of the household upon women. This fourth form of sexage is addressed by Delphi. Delphi, a feminist of the early 1970s, pointed out the inferior position of women within a family or a household. Within a marriage, Delphi explains that a woman's household work is equivalent to 24/7 unpaid labor, in which this work is ultimately all the jobs men do not wish to do or not even consider to be work. She uses this to demonstrate that the relationships between men and women are structured upon power, especially in jobs. This power difference serves as a fundamental reason for the non-patriarchal women's advocating for equality of power between men and women. While materialist feminism looks at the effects of the patriarchal society onto socioeconomic oppression of women, psychoanalytic feminism focuses on the effects of the patriarchal society on women's psychological experience. Tyson addresses how, in order for materialist freedom to be sustained, women must first achieve psychological liberation. In order to examine the psychoanalytic feminist lens, one must consider the effects of language on the psychological oppression of women. In a patriarchal society, language is what defines the sexual difference between man and woman. This meaning, language defines patriarchal binary thought, which Helen Cixous describes to be the perception of the world in terms of polar opposites used to establish a superior. Opposites such as head or heart, activity or passivity, father or mother all serve to describe the patriarchal thinking in which the male occupies the left side of these opposites and woman is defined by the right. This, as a result, leads women to feel naturally submissive to men. Cixous believes that in order for women to combat this patriarchal binary thought and liberate themselves from the patriarchal society, they are not to attempt to achieve equal status in the current patriarchal society, but rather to establish a feminine language that counters patriarchal binary thought. She explains that this feminine language is best represented in feminine writing, or écriture féminine. This writing focuses on using language and ideas developed from bonds with women's mothers, who Tyson describes to be their original source of power and energy. This positive representation of women's power is seen by Cixous to be an act of liberation. Authors ranging from Marguerite Duras, Toni Morrison, and William Faulkner all seemingly use écriture féminine within their texts to forward their feminist perspectives. Similar to Cixous, Irigaray emphasizes that language is the root of the psychological oppression of women. She describes how language itself is structured upon patriarchal thought, therefore making the words and thoughts of women not actually theirs. The woman is just a mirror of their own masculinity. This, as a result, leaves women with only two ways to behave in the patriarchal society: stay silent, as any non-patriarchal idea said by a woman is illogical to the ears of the patriarchy, or conform to the inferior role of woman in the society. This inferior role Cixous addresses is not only established by language, but also the male gaze, which describes women to be only an object to be seen. While Irigaray shows that language is the root of the patriarchy, she also points out how language can combat the patriarchal institution. She encourages the establishment of woman-only groups that develop women speak, a non-patriarchal way of thinking and speaking. And like écriture féminine, woman speak finds its source in woman and the female body. The ideas of écriture féminine and woman speak are not all shared between French psychoanalytic feminists, however. Julia Kristeva, a French psychoanalytic feminist, believes that these forms of liberation only serve to allow for the patriarchal essentialization of women that hides the diversity of feminism. Kristeva instead suggests getting beyond the patriarchy through the semiotic dimension of language. This dimension, in contrast to the symbolic dimension that consists of the denotation of words and language, focuses on the intonation and rhythm of language that is innate even to infants. She believes this intuitive nature of thinking and language, accessed through art and literature, allows for the society to strip away the patriarchal thinking of men and women alike. Kristeva, like many other French feminists, address how the biological nature of women or their sex is what gives them fewer rights. This contrasts the Anglo-American feminist perspective in which gender difference is what oppresses women. The fact of sexual difference rather than gender difference for French feminists is what allows them to point out how patriarchy controls how gender and sex is seen in the same way. Therefore, to French feminists, there is no difference between gender and sex. This is not the only difference between American and French feminism. While the ideas presented in French psychoanalytic feminism are often addressed within the realm of American feminism, French materialist feminism is rarely discussed by American feminists. This is a result of what Tyson describes to be how American academia is more accustomed to the kind of abstract theorizing we find in French psychoanalytic feminism, and therefore welcomed it more readily. This emphasizes the dissent and incongruity within feminism between various feminists within a country and around the world. Although all women face similar opposition from the patriarchal values embedded in society, it is important to recognize the differences between various types of feminists. When documenting feminism, the experiences of white, heterosexual women often emerge as the dominant narrative being told. However, there's a diverse collection of experiences that make up the complete narrative. This reveals the value of multicultural feminism, which places an emphasis on the many perspectives of women as the result of diverse characteristics among women. These characteristics include socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, race, educational experience, religion, nationality, and geographic location. Consequently, we need to acknowledge these cultural differences in women and give them the platform to share those insights. Tyson notes that despite these distinctions, sisterhood, the connection between women resulting from the commonalities women share from their experience of being women, cannot be prevented among women. The differences that are prevalent among women are valuable, as they can provide useful insights into the diversity of the experiences of women due to differences in culture. This can be seen in the criticism of African American feminists, who call out white feminists' failure to acknowledge the experience of those of a culture different than theirs. Particularly, they call out the ways in which the treatment of black and white women are so different. Historically, the white ideal of a woman was unassertive, dainty, and innocent, none of which could describe black or poor women, who were forced to go into intense, heavy labor that exposed them to the threat of rape and sexual exploitation. Because of these circumstances, black women were not viewed as true women by both black and white men and white women. Unfortunately, some of these beliefs are still prevalent today, causing black women to be in a double bind, as Tyson describes. African American women become trapped between the expectations of their race and their gender. They're expected to advocate for both groups, but are also alienated by both, each telling them that the issues of one group are more pressing than the other. This double bind is extremely destructive, as black women end up living in a society that neglects not only their race but also their gender. Some African American women acknowledge that it provides unique insights into the complexity of the female experience. Lauren Bethel, an African American poet and feminist, points out that the concept of the double bind is essential to African American feminist criticism because the basis of many African American feminist texts is the unjust treatment black women are subject to. Such texts allow black women to reveal the oppression they receive for their gender and race, celebrate their accomplishments, and establish their rich culture. In order to write about these experiences, a deep awareness and understanding of the double bind between gender and sex is required. However, not all African American women share Bethel's view. Some view feminism as a cause of division within the black community, so they turn to other ideologies that have ideas that are either separate and distinct from feminism, or ones that reach a middle ground between the black community and the feminist community. Alice Walker, a renowned African American author and social activist, turned to the latter by declaring herself a womanist, which Tyson describes as someone who works for the survival and wholeness of her people, men and women both, and for the promotion of dialogue and community, as well as for the valorization of women and of all the varieties of work women perform. Other African American women promote ethnic cultural feminism, which places its focus on their ethnic group and the female cultural values of it, as opposed to the universal feminist cultural values. Although this form of feminism calls out the discrimination of certain ethnic groups within the feminist community, its purpose is not to provide a solution for this prevalent issue. For black women, ethnic cultural feminism allows them to recognize the diverse female cultural values as a result of the oppression they have faced in the past and continue to face today. African American criticism is just one example of the many schools of literary criticism that deal with women's issues. Other schools, such as lesbian criticism, Marxist criticism, and post-colonial criticism, can speak upon women's issues, but criticism is only considered feminist when the writer is speaking from a feminist perspective. Because of the many areas of overlap between schools of literary criticism, some literary critics refer to themselves as a hybrid of multiple categories, such as a Native American feminist critic or a lesbian Marxist feminist critic.